Welcome back. In the great game of global power, it's easy to think the biggest, most aggressive move is always the best one. But what if the most powerful move is no move at all? Today, we're diving into a strategic mindset where patience isn't just a virtue, it's a weapon.
All right, so let's get right to the heart of it. We live in this 24/7 news cycle, a world of instant reactions, right? So why does Russia so often seem to just wait? Is it hesitation, or is it something far more calculated?
Well, from Moscow's perspective, what looks like inaction to us is actually a deliberate, strategic choice. The whole idea is that the best move isn't always the fastest one. It's about playing the long game.
And the logic here is pretty clear. A massive, sudden escalation could totally backfire. It risks uniting all of your adversaries, creating a solid wall against you, and basically forcing a Cold War 2.0 scenario, a situation they are keen to avoid.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This quote tells us the strategy is less about military positioning and more about psychological warfare. It's about perception management. The goal is to avoid causing a full-blown panic that would trigger a massive coordinated response. So what's the end game with all this patience? Well, the theory goes that by not making yourself the #1 global threat, you allow other dynamics to play out. You let internal pressures in Western countries, political divisions, economic stress, election cycles build up and do the work for you, eroding their unity and resolve over time. Okay, so that's the waiting game. But what happens when Russia does decide to act? That's where this next crucial concept comes in, the asymmetric response. It's all about avoiding the predictable tit for tat and choosing your own time and place to respond. This is absolutely central to the doctrine. So if an opponent hits them with financial sanctions, they don't just hit back with the same thing. They might respond with a cyber operation. Or if they're facing diplomatic pressure in one region, they might make a strategic move somewhere else entirely. The goal is always to break that predictable action-reaction cycle. And that brings us to the other key tool here, strategic ambiguity. When we talk about red lines, we usually think of a clear boundary. But in this doctrine, the red lines are intentionally kept vague. They're not a wall, they're a fog. So why make them foggy? It creates uncertainty, which forces opponents to be more cautious. It gives you maximum flexibility to decide how and when you'll respond. And maybe most importantly, it applies constant psychological pressure. Your adversaries are always wondering if their next move will be the one that finally crosses that invisible line. So if you put all these pieces together, the patience, the asymmetry, the ambiguity, you arrive at the absolute core of this doctrine. It's the belief that modern conflicts aren't won in short, decisive battles anymore. They're won in a long, grueling marathon between entire systems. It's a test of endurance. You could think of it as a clash of two totally different operating philosophies. One interpretation suggests the Western model is optimized for short-term market logic, efficiency, and quarterly profits. The Russian approach, in contrast, is geared for the long haul, prioritizing national sovereignty and industrial depth, even if it's less efficient day to day. And because the philosophies are different, the tools are different. Instead of trying to use overwhelming military or financial pressure to force a quick change, the focus shifts to sustained, grinding pressure. The goal isn't to break the enemy's army, but to simply wear down the political will of the nations supporting them. This difference in the perception of time is probably the single most important takeaway. For one side, success is measured in things you can see right away: media headlines, quarterly reports, battlefield gains. For the other, success is measured in long-term geopolitical shifts that might take decades to become clear. They're running on completely different clocks. And this quote from a geostrategist, it really captures the confidence behind that mindset. He's saying, yeah, we're massively outmatched on paper, economically, but we're winning because our system is built to endure. The underlying argument is that the West system, though bigger, is also more brittle and can't handle this kind of long-term pressure. So if your whole strategy is based on endurance, then time itself becomes your #1 weapon. The entire approach is designed to exploit what these analysts see as a fundamental vulnerability in the West, a pacing problem. I mean, just look at this contrast in planning. While one side is often forced to think in 2 to 4 year election cycles, the other is working on 10-year armament programs and 20-year infrastructure plans. According to this view, that's not just a minor difference. It's a massive strategic advantage that shapes every single decision. The core belief here is that Western societies are fundamentally optimized for sprints, not marathons.
They're seen as being vulnerable to things like media fatigue, the constant pressure of elections that demand short-term results, and a much lower public tolerance for the kind of prolonged economic pain that a long conflict demands.
And when you apply this logic to the war in Ukraine, you see that from this perspective, it's more than just a military operation. It's a live stress test. The goal isn't just to win on the battlefield, but to impose such high, continuous costs on the Western coalition that their political and economic support systems eventually just crack under the strain. And that really brings us to the central question posed by this clash of strategic doctrines. It's a question not just for politicians or generals, but for all of us. Which of these approaches, which strategy, would your society be willing to tolerate for longer? To really get your head around this viewpoint, you first have to kind of erase the old roles. The core belief here is that the global system we've all known since 1945 isn't just in trouble, it's already gone. It has ceased to exist. Let's dig into what that actually means.
According to this school of thought, the world isn't just going through a change, it's collapsing. And this isn't seen as some kind of temporary crisis that can be managed with a bit of diplomacy or a few economic tweaks. No, it's seen as a fundamental, irreversible breakdown of the entire post-war order, basically a complete system failure.
So if the old system is broken, what's the new operating system for international relations? From this perspective, what are the new rules of the game?
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast this presents. The old system, which, many in the West still see as the ideal, was built on things like international law, global institutions, and predictable rules. But the new system, from this viewpoint, operates on a totally different logic: the law of force, competing spheres of influence, and a state of what they see as permanent conflict.
And this brings us back to a really old concept, realpolitik. This is a system of politics based on practical, material things, rather than ideals. And in the context we're talking about, it means that power, resources, and geography are the only variables that truly matter. Morality and ideology, well, they're seen as luxuries you can't really afford. Okay, so this brings us to the logic of confrontation. From a pure realpolitik perspective, a direct conflict with the West wasn't really seen as a choice, but as something that was structurally inevitable. Let's unpack why that is. You see, for decades, a key part of this strategic thinking has been the narrative of encirclement. This timeline here kind of lays it out, showing NATO's consistent eastward expansion. It starts in 1999, moves through the Baltic states in 2004, and just keeps going right up to the present. For Moscow, this doesn't look like a series of isolated defensive moves, but more like a single, slow, and very deliberate strategy of containment. And this brings us to the economic side of that pressure. According to some Russian sources, we're talking about more than 30,000 individual sanctions being applied since 2014. And again, this isn't interpreted as a response to specific events, but as part of a much broader economic war designed to weaken the state from the inside out. All of this leads to a pretty stark conclusion, as one analyst put it. One interpretation suggests that without some kind of active resistance, the combined military and economic pressure would have eventually just led to the country's gradual dissolution. So in this view, conflict actually became a tool for survival. So with the old rules gone and confrontation seen as basically inevitable, what kind of world emerges from that? Well, this brings us to the core metaphor of this entire analysis, the global savannah. This is the concept of the global savannah. We're in a normal world where there is one law, the law of force. Think about it. In a savannah, there are predators and there is prey. Alliances are temporary, and survival is the only real objective. The old norms have just vanished. And in this savannah, ideology becomes secondary. Whether a country is a democracy, a monarchy, or a theocracy, it's just less important than its ability to survive. Survival, in this view, depends completely on tangible assets and sovereign control. So, the crucial point is this. These four elements right here are seen as the absolute requirements for survival in this new era. You have to have undisputed control of your territory and your borders. You need secure access to natural resources. You have to possess military and technological sovereignty, and all of it, it's argued, must be managed by a strong centralized state. And this brings up a really challenging thought experiment. What if your country saw the world this way? How would national priorities and strategies change if this ruthless competitive landscape was the assumed reality that everyone was operating from? Okay, so if the old global institutions like the UN are seen as failing,
What kind of new alliances pop up in a world that's governed by the law of force? Well, this is where we see the rise of what some are starting to call the sovereignty club. Western analysts often look at these emerging blocs, like the expanded BRICS, and they ask this very question. How can nations with such wildly different political systems, you've got theocracies, monarchies, federal republics, how can they possibly cooperate? From the outside, the internal contradictions just look immense.
But from Moscow's perspective, the answer lies in finding the greatest common denominator. This is a strategy where you deliberately ignore all the differences, values, culture, political systems, all of it, to focus on the one single overriding interest that unites every single member. And for these emerging blocs, that one unifying interest is absolute economic and political sovereignty. The shared goal is simply the ability to control your own national destiny, without external pressure, without sanctions, without interference from any other power bloc.
And the whole pivot away from Western-led financial systems is framed in this context. As one official put it, we are not conducting anti-dollar campaigns. We are just not allowed to settle in dollars. So what are we supposed to do? See, from this viewpoint, it's not an ideological attack. It's a practical necessity for survival, driven by sanction.
And this gets right to the core logic. The goal, from this perspective, isn't to be anti-Western, it's to be pro-themselves. It is all about building a parallel system where national interests, defined by tangible power and sovereignty, are the only guiding principles in this new global savannah.
So, over the last 3 episodes, we've looked at this new multipolar world, the big shifts in economic power, and even the tech arms race. But now, we're going to get to the most important question of all. What does this long-term confrontation with Russia actually mean for you?
It's kind of like a weather system. You can focus on the daily forecast, the headlines, the flare-ups, or you can try to understand the high-pressure and low-pressure zones that are creating the weather in the first place. Once you see the system, you can start to anticipate the storms.
And look, this isn't just some abstract, high-level question. This explainer is all about connecting those huge geopolitical strategies to the very real things that will shape your daily life, whether you're in the US, the UK, or anywhere in the EU. So let's dive in by looking at a fundamental difference in how each side even sees this whole thing.
Okay, Section 1, a different calculation of risk. To really get what's going on, we have to understand that this isn't just about different goals. It's almost like they're playing 2 completely different games on the same board.
From Moscow's point of view, the entire Western strategy is based on one massive bet, that Russia's internal collapse is just a matter of time. The thinking, from their perspective, is that Western policy is all about pushing and squeezing to make that happen faster.
You might be asking, why not just escalate? Why the slow, grinding approach? Well, from this viewpoint, a huge, shocking move would actually be a mistake. It would create a panic, and that would unite the West, focusing all of its immense resources on Russia. The patient strategy, on the other hand, is designed to avoid waking that sleeping giant.
Okay, so if the main strategy isn't direct military escalation, what is it? How do you even fight a global war of attrition? Well, the answer seems to be, you build a parallel world. This idea is absolutely critical to understanding the whole strategy behind groups like BRICS. It's not about trying to crash the US dollar or tear down existing institutions. It's about building a whole new operating system for finance, for trade, for logistics that runs in parallel. Over time, the old system just becomes less and less relevant.
And this slide pretty much shows you the playbook. According to people like Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, who's a key figure in this, the whole model is built on patience and consensus. You find the one thing everyone from Brazil to Iran can agree on, which is economic sovereignty, and you build from there. The structure is designed to be flexible and resilient, specifically to avoid the pitfalls they feel have been used against them in other institutions.
This little quote from Ryabkov says it all, really. Don't fix what works. To Western eye, an organization with no headquarters and no formal treaty might look weak or unfinished. But from this perspective, that's not a bug. It's the main feature. A decentralized network is seen as something you can't easily sanction, you can't corrupt, and you can't weaponize like a traditional centralized body.
Right. Section 3, the price of systemic friction. Here's the thing. A world trying to run 2 different operating systems at the same time is not going to be smooth. It creates friction, economically, politically, and that friction, well, it has a price a price that you are going to pay.
This chart just gives you a simple visual of the two roads ahead. The path of permanent confrontation means a world of constant pressure on your budget, on supply chains, on prices. The other path, negotiated stabilization, suggests a world where those pressures are eased up a bit, even if the big disagreements are still there.
And this is where that high-level geopolitical game lands right in your kitchen. This systemic friction is why your groceries cost more and will likely stay that way. It's why filling up your car feels like a roller coaster. It's how food itself can become a political weapon. And it means more of our tax money goes toward defense budgets, while at the same time, our digital lives get monitored more and more, all in the name of security.
So all of this leads us to the fundamental challenge of the era we're in now. And that's Section 4, a world without trust.
You know, at the end of the day, stability requires people to be able to talk to each other. And talking requires at least a basic level of trust. The problem, according to many analysts, isn't just that countries disagree. It's that the very platforms built for dialogue, the UN, the G7, all of them are losing their power because the shared trust that made them work is just gone.
So maybe the final question isn't about who's right and who's wrong. Maybe it's more practical than that. If we really are living in a long-term reality of two competing systems, maybe the challenge isn't about finding a way to win. Maybe it's about figuring out how to manage a chronic condition and navigating the consequences for all of us.
Thank you for joining us for this analysis. If you've watched the earlier parts of this series, I'd be really interested to hear if this perspective changed how you see them at all. Let us know in the comments. And of course, this explainer is designed to complement the first 3 episodes of the Global Savannah.